August 1942, 10 p.m., Times Square. The neon paradise of Broadway, the place they called the crossroads of the world, went dark in seconds. Not from a power failure, not from a storm, by order, complete blackout. Theaters playing to packed houses suddenly cut their shows mid-performance. The Great White Way, that stretch of brilliant marquees and electric signs visible from miles away, vanished into darkness. Taxi drivers pulled to the curb and killed their headlights. People walking home from dinner stopped mid-stride on Fifth Avenue, confused, reaching for building walls to guide themselves. And in the subway stations below, riders waiting for trains heard the sirens wailing above ground and wondered if this was finally it. If the war they'd been reading about in Europe and the Pacific had just arrived at their doorstep. But here's what most New Yorkers didn't know that night. What the newspapers weren't printing. What Mayor La Guardia and military officials were keeping quiet. German submarines had been operating just off the coast for months, close enough that their captains could see the Manhattan skyline glowing against the night. Close enough to count the ships leaving New York Harbor, silhouetted perfectly against the city lights like targets in a shooting gallery. This isn't a story about a single dramatic night. It's about how America's largest city transformed itself in 1942, how 8 million people learned to live in partial darkness, and why turning off the lights became a matter of life and death. Chapter 1: A City Unprepared. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the attack that changed everything, came on a Sunday morning, and by Monday New York City had become a different place. Not physically, not yet, but psychologically. The war was no longer over there, it was here. New York in 1941 was the biggest, brightest city on Earth. 8 million people crammed into 5 boroughs. The financial capital of the world. A port that handled more cargo than any other in America. And at night, it was a beacon visible for miles. Electric signs blazed across Times Square. Streetlights lined every avenue. Office buildings left their lights burning all night. The Statue of Liberty's torch, powered by 13,000-watt lamps, could be seen from passing ships 30 miles out to sea. Nobody thought much about it. Why would they? Electricity was progress. Light meant safety. Darkness belonged to an earlier age, but December 7th changed the calculation. Within days of Pearl Harbor, military planners started looking at New York with new eyes. Not as a symbol of American prosperity, as a target, the nation's biggest port, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, already ramping up warship production, Manhattan's financial district, where the country's money moved. All of it sitting exposed on the Atlantic coast, lit up like a carnival. Mayor La Guardia understood the problem immediately. A short, energetic man who'd served as a pilot in World War I, La Guardia didn't wait for federal orders. Within a week of Pearl Harbor, he started organizing practice blackouts. But organizing a blackout in New York City wasn't like organizing one in a small town in Kansas. You had 8 million people who needed to cooperate. Thousands of buildings, millions of lights, a subway system that never stopped running, theaters and restaurants doing business until midnight or later. And here's what made it urgent. The threat wasn't theoretical. On January 13, 1942, just over a month after Pearl Harbor, 5 German U-boats reached American waters. Operation Drumbeat, the Germans called it. Admiral Karl Dönitz had sent his submarines across the Atlantic with specific orders. Sink merchant ships, destroy tankers, cut off the supplies flowing to Britain, and do it right off the American coast, where the U.S. Navy was unprepared and coastal cities refused to dim their lights. The submarines arrived at night. They'd spend the day submerged, sitting on the ocean floor, conserving fuel and staying hidden. When darkness fell, they'd surface and move into position. And what they saw shocked even the German submariners. American ships sailing without escort, no convoys, no destroyers protecting them, and behind the ships, lighting them up perfectly, the glow of American cities. Atlantic City, Miami, New York. One U-boat captain, Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-123, couldn't believe his eyes. He later described seeing ships pass by completely illuminated against the bright lights of Long Island and New York City. It was like shooting at targets in broad daylight. The ships had nowhere to hide. Every vessel leaving New York Harbor was perfectly visible. Easy prey. On January 14th, U-123 sank the Norwegian tanker Nornes within sight of Long Island, 60 miles from Montauk Point. Close enough that people on shore might have heard the explosion if the wind was right. The next night, Hardigan sank the British tanker Coimbra off Sandy Hook. These weren't attacks happening far out in the Atlantic. These were attacks in America's backyard. And still, New York's lights stayed on. The military knew. British intelligence had warned U.S. Navy headquarters on January 12th that German submarines were heading for American waters, specifically the coast between Portland, Maine, and New York. Admiral Ernest King received the intelligence, but the response was slow, disorganized, confused. Part of the problem was simple denial. American naval commanders didn't believe German submarines could operate so close to shore. The water was too shallow in places. The risk of detection seemed too high. They'd assumed U-boats would stick to the deep Atlantic, far from land. They were wrong. The other problem was stubbornness. The British had learned hard lessons about submarine warfare in 1917 and again after 1939. They'd developed the convoy system, where merchant ships traveled in groups protected by warships. They'd learned to impose strict blackouts along their coasts. They offered to share this knowledge with the Americans. Admiral King, proud and independent, largely ignored the advice. Through January and February and March of 1942, German submarines had what they later called their second happy time. A turkey shoot. In the first 3 weeks of January alone, 9 German U-boats destroyed 35 Allied merchant ships and a British destroyer. They killed 1,219 crew members and passengers. By April, the death toll had climbed past 400 on drumbeat alone. From January through July 1942, German U-boats sank 233 ships in American waters. Over 5,000 seamen and passengers died, more than twice the number killed at Pearl Harbor, and the whole time, New York City's lights kept burning. Chapter 2. The Port That Couldn't Stop. To understand why the blackouts mattered, you need to understand what New York represented in 1942. It wasn't just another American city. It was the logistics hub for the entire Allied war effort. The Port of New York in 1942 covered 650 miles of waterfront, from the Hudson River piers to the Brooklyn docks to Staten Island's shore facilities. Hundreds of warehouses, dozens of shipyards, and at the heart of it all, the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The Brooklyn Navy Yard in December 1941 employed 18,000 workers. By June 1942, that number had climbed past 42,000. By late 1944, it would peak at over 71,000 people working around the clock in 3 8-hour shifts. They were building battleships. The USS Iowa, which would launch in August 1942. The USS Missouri, which would become famous as the site of Japan's surrender. They were repairing damaged warships, converting cargo vessels to military use, building aircraft carriers, manufacturing uniforms, packing combat provisions, creating everything a modern Navy needed. The Navy Yard wasn't the only facility. Private shipyards lined Brooklyn's waterfront. Todd Shipyards, Sullivan Dry Dock, Robbins Dry Dock and Repair Company. Queens had facilities too. The Bronx had shipbuilding operations. all of them working overtime, all of them essential to the war effort. And every night, all that activity was lit up like a beacon for German submarines. Admiral Karl Dönitz wasn't stupid. He knew New York's harbor was too well defended for a direct attack. Forts protected the Narrows, the waterway leading into New York Harbor, Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, Fort Wadsworth on Staten Island. Any U-boat trying to enter the harbor would be spotted and destroyed. But Dönitz didn't need to enter the harbor. He just needed to sink the ships leaving it. The math was simple and brutal. Every tanker carrying fuel to Britain that got sunk meant less fuel for British planes and tanks. Every cargo ship loaded with weapons and supplies sent to the bottom meant fewer resources for Allied armies. Every transport ship destroyed meant American soldiers who couldn't get overseas. If German submarines could sink, enough ships faster than American yards could build them. They could starve Britain into submission and make an invasion of Europe impossible. And New York's bright lights were making their job easy. This created a dilemma for city officials. The port couldn't stop operating. The war effort depended on it. But every ship that left New York Harbor at night was doing so illuminated against the city's glow, visible to any submarine lurking offshore. Governor Herbert Lehman and Mayor La Guardia started pushing for action in late 1941. They wanted coastal blackouts. They wanted ships sailing in convoys. They wanted Navy destroyers protecting merchant vessels. They got bureaucracy and delay. The U.S. Navy in early 1942 didn't have enough destroyers to protect coastal shipping. Most of the destroyer fleet was stationed in the North Atlantic, protecting the convoys sailing to Iceland and Britain. The eastern seaboard, where most of the sinkings were happening, had less than 5% of available destroyers. Ships were being slaughtered, and there weren't enough warships to stop it. Admiral King finally started organizing coastal convoys in May 1942. The first one sailed on May 14th from Hampton Roads to Key West. But that was 4 months after the U-boat attacks began. 4 months of unprotected ships. 4 months of unnecessary deaths. The blackout regulations came faster. By January 1942, practice drills were happening. By May 18, 1942, New York City imposed nightly dimouts that would last until 1945. But getting 8 million New Yorkers to cooperate wasn't simple. The regulations were specific and complicated. All illuminated advertising had to be shut off permanently. Theaters could have faint lights, but only on the undersides of their marquees, just bright enough for people entering and leaving to see where they were going. At home, any lamp visible from outside had to point downward. People living above the 15th floor of skyscrapers had to either turn off their lights or hide them behind blackout curtains. Streetlights throughout the city had to be dimmed or turned off entirely during drills. Times Square, that explosion of light and color and energy, went dark. Coney Island's bright boardwalk lights vanished. The Statue of Liberty's torch, which had burned bright since 1886, was replaced with 2 small 200-watt air warning bulbs. Even the skylights in Penn Station and the Ansonia Hotel were tarred over. New York at night stopped looking like New York, but the transformation went deeper than just turning off lights. The city organized itself for war in ways that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Chapter 3. Citizen Soldiers of the Home Front. By early 1942, New York City had organized the largest civilian defense network in America, and it was run by a mayor who didn't do anything halfway. Fiorello LaGuardia had 2 jobs in 1942. He was mayor of New York City, a job that would have been overwhelming for most people even in peacetime. And he was director of the Office of Civilian Defense, a federal position reporting directly to President Roosevelt. LaGuardia would spend 3 days a week in Washington and 4 days in New York, shuttling between 2 cities and 2 massive responsibilities. The Office of Civilian Defense, created in May 1941, had a simple mission that turned out to be anything but simple. Prepare American cities for potential enemy attack. That meant organizing air raid warning systems, training volunteers, preparing shelters, creating emergency response teams, teaching millions of ordinary Americans what to do if bombs started falling on their neighborhoods. By January 1942, just 8 months after the OCD was created, it had established 8,478 local civilian defense councils across America. It had organized 334 6 auxiliary police, and it had recruited and trained 773 air raid wardens. Air raid wardens became the face of home front defense. Regular people, neighbors and shop owners and office workers who volunteered to keep their communities safe. They wore white helmets with CD painted on the front. They carried flashlights, gas masks, first aid kits, and whistles. And they patrolled the streets during blackout drills, making sure every light in every building was off. The job sounds simple. It wasn't. An air raid warden was responsible for a specific block or neighborhood. During the day, they'd visit residents and explain the rules. Show people how to hang blackout curtains. Teach them how to fight an incendiary bomb fire if one came through their roof. Explain what the different siren sounds meant. Make sure every household had emergency supplies. At night during drills, the wardens would patrol in darkness, watching for any light that shouldn't be visible. They took the job seriously. If they saw a light on in an apartment and nobody responded to their knock, they had the authority to enter and turn it off. Some wardens, convinced that any light could guide enemy bombers to their neighborhood, would even shoot out bulbs that were left on. The wardens understood something most Americans didn't. This wasn't just theater. This wasn't just going through the motions. Ships were being sunk off the coast. People were dying. And every light visible from the air or sea could cost lives. In New York specifically, the Civilian Defense Organization grew to enormous size. By mid-1942, tens of thousands of volunteers had signed up. Not just air raid wardens. Fire spotters who'd watch from rooftops for signs of fires caused by incendiary bombs. Auxiliary police who'd help maintain order during emergencies. Medical teams trained to handle mass casualties. Decontamination squads prepared to deal with chemical weapons. Messenger services for when phone lines went down. The city published handbooks. Handbook for Air Raid Wardens. What Can I Do? The Citizen's Handbook for War. Detailed guides explaining everything from first aid to firefighting to how to recognize different types of enemy aircraft. Schools held drills. Offices held drills. Entire neighborhoods practiced evacuating to shelters. The wail of air raid sirens, testing the warning system, became a regular part of New York life. And then came the surprise blackouts. The early blackout drills were advertised in advance. The newspapers would announce that on such and such date, at such and such time, the sirens would sound and the city would go dark for 30 minutes. This gave people time to prepare. Get home before it started. Make sure their windows were covered. Know where to take shelter. But announced drills had a problem. They didn't test whether the system would work during an actual attack. When people know something's coming, they prepare. When they don't know it's coming, you find out what really happens. So in August 1942, New York held its first surprise blackout drill. No advance warning, no newspaper announcements. Just 10 p.m. on a weeknight, and suddenly the sirens started wailing. Chapter 4. The Night. Everything went dark. August 1942. The exact date would be announced only in the newspapers the next morning. But for the people of New York that night, what mattered wasn't the date. What mattered was the chaos. 10 o'clock came. The sirens started. That rising and falling wail that people had heard in practice, but this time without warning. and within minutes, streetlights across the 5 boroughs started going dark. Traffic lights went out. Subway stations dimmed their lights. Theaters stopped mid-performance and rushed patrons to the exits. Restaurants went dark with diners still at their tables. People's reactions varied. Some had been through enough drills to know what to do. Head inside. Cover your windows. Turn off your lights. Wait for the all clear. Others panicked. Drivers pulled over suddenly, causing near accidents. Pedestrians ran for the nearest subway station. Someone in a Brooklyn apartment building pulled the fire alarm, thinking the darkness meant an electrical fire. And within minutes of the blackout starting, people started dying. Joseph Waring, 70 years old, was waiting for a train on a subway platform in Brooklyn. When the siren sounded and the lights dimmed, he apparently lost his bearings. He stumbled, fell from the platform onto the tracks. By the time doctors and the police emergency squad reached him, he was dead. And as they worked to recover his body, everything went completely black. The blackout had reached the subway system. The rescue workers found themselves working in almost total darkness, trying to recover a man who'd just been killed by the very drill designed to protect people. Louise Biancardi, also 70 years old, was at home when the siren started. The sound frightened her. She rushed into the hallway of her building, perhaps looking for neighbors, perhaps trying to get to a shelter. Her heart couldn't take the stress. She collapsed and died of a heart attack brought on by what the newspapers would later call the excitement. And then there was Julian Joisas, a motorcycle policeman in Queens. His job that night was to enforce the blackout regulations. Stop any vehicles that didn't pull over when the siren sounded. Make sure cars had their headlights off. Keep traffic moving safely in near total darkness. Around 10:30 p.m., he spotted a car that hadn't stopped, hadn't dimmed its lights. He went after it on his motorcycle. The driver either didn't see Joisas or refused to stop. The chase went on for several blocks. At some point, trying to cut off the vehicle, Joisas had to jump his motorcycle across a concrete divider. He didn't make it. The motorcycle hit wrong and threw him to the ground. Broken ribs, fractured shoulder blade, possible internal injuries. He ended up in the hospital, one more casualty of a drill that was supposed to protect people. The blackout lasted 30 minutes. In that half hour, 7 other accidents occurred throughout the city, minor crashes, people injured in falls, confusion in the darkness leading to injuries that wouldn't have happened if the lights had stayed on. When the all clear sounded and the lights came back up, Mayor La Guardia held a press conference. He called the drill an excellent performance. He praised New Yorkers for their cooperation. He didn't mention Joseph Waring. He didn't mention Louise Biancardi. He didn't mention the 7 accidents or Julian Joisas in the hospital. That information would come out later, in newspaper reports that raised uncomfortable questions about whether the drills were worth the cost. But LaGuardia's praise wasn't entirely political spin. From a military perspective, the drill had worked. The city had gone dark in minutes. Anyone looking from the air or from offshore would have seen a dramatic reduction in visible light. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, that beacon of industrial activity, had dimmed significantly. Times Square had vanished. The glow that made New York visible from miles away had been substantially reduced. The problems were practical, not conceptual. How do you keep 8 million people safe when you suddenly turn off all the lights? How do you prevent accidents when traffic lights go dark? How do you keep the subways running safely? How do you evacuate theaters without causing a stampede? These weren't easy questions, and the answers came through trial and error, through successive drills, through slowly teaching an entire city new habits. The surprise blackout drills continued. Philadelphia had one. Washington, D.C. had one. Cities up and down the East Coast practiced going dark without warning. Each drill caused accidents. Each drill had casualties. But military planners considered them necessary. Better to have accidents during drills than to have people unprepared when real bombs started falling. Except the real bombs never fell on American cities. Not on New York, not on Boston or Philadelphia or Washington. The German Air Force never had the range to reach America's East Coast. The threat that justified all these drills, all these casualties, all this disruption never materialized. But the submarine threat was real. Ships kept getting sunk, sailors kept dying, and the blackouts, the dimouts, the darkening of America's coastal cities may have helped save lives at sea. Chapter 5. Living in the Dark. By summer 1942, the dimouts had become part of daily life in New York. Not just during drills, every night. A permanent feature of wartime existence. The regulations were clear. All illuminated advertising off permanently, no exceptions. Those giant electric signs that had made Times Square famous, that had drawn tourists from around the world, stayed dark for the duration of the war. Theaters couldn't light their marquees except for small lights on the underside, just enough to guide people in and out. Neon signs were banned. Storefront windows couldn't be brightly lit after dark. At home, the rules were equally strict. Any light visible from outside had to point downward. People bought special dark curtains or painted their skylights black. Families living in tall buildings, above the 15th floor, had the strictest requirements. Their lights could potentially be seen from far offshore. If they couldn't block the light completely, they had to keep their apartments dark at night. Street lighting throughout the city was reduced. Some streets went completely dark. Others had lighting so dim you could barely see 10 feet ahead. People learned to walk carefully at night, feeling their way along familiar streets that looked entirely different in the darkness. The impact on the city was profound. New York had been the city that never slept, where you could find restaurants and clubs in activity at any hour. Now, after dark, much of that life disappeared. Businesses closed earlier because customers didn't want to navigate the dark streets. Entertainment shifted to earlier hours. The late-night culture that had defined the city faded away, but life continued. People adapted. Taxi drivers learned to navigate with minimal lighting. Restaurants served dinner by candlelight, though they had to be careful not to have too much light visible from the windows. Theaters continued performing, though with much smaller crowds. Broadway didn't shut down, but it operated in semi-darkness. The changes were strange and often frustrating. People complained. Tourists stopped coming. Why visit New York when you couldn't see the sights? Business owners worried about the economic impact. Artists and writers mourned the loss of the city's nighttime magic. But underneath the complaints, there was something else. A sense of purpose, a feeling of shared sacrifice. Everyone in New York knew people in the military. Sons and brothers and fathers serving overseas, friends working at the Navy Yard, or in war production. The dim-out was uncomfortable, but it connected civilians to the war effort. It made them feel like they were contributing something, even if that something was just accepting darkness. And there were unexpected benefits. Astronomers noted that for the first time since 1917, you could see stars from the middle of Times Square. The night sky, invisible for decades under the city's bright lights, became visible again. The Milky Way could be seen from Brooklyn. The moon seemed brighter without competing with electric lights. Photographers documented the transformation. Pictures from 1942 and 1943 show a New York that looks almost like a different city. Times Square in semi-darkness, with just a few faint lights visible. The Brooklyn Bridge at night, its usual brilliant illumination replaced with minimal safety lighting. the Manhattan skyline usually blazing with lights from thousands of buildings, now showing only scattered dimmed windows. It was eerie, it was unsettling, it was temporary. But for 3 years, this was normal. This was what New York looked like at night during the war. The blackout regulations extended beyond just lighting. Window displays had to be minimal. Stores couldn't use bright lights to show off their merchandise. Even private homes had to be careful. Air raid wardens would patrol residential streets, watching for any light leaking through curtains or from uncovered windows. If they saw a violation, they'd knock on the door. Politely, but firmly remind the residents of the rules. Most people complied. But enforcement was difficult. You can't watch every window in every building in a city of 8 million people. The system relied largely on voluntary cooperation, and most New Yorkers, despite complaints and inconvenience, followed the rules. The economics of the dim-out created winners and losers. Movie theaters did well. Entertainment that happened indoors, in the dark, wasn't affected by blackout regulations. People still wanted to go out, still wanted to have fun, and movies provided that without requiring bright lights. But nightclubs and restaurants struggled. Outdoor entertainment largely died. The bright lights and spectacle that had made New York nightlife famous were gone. War production plants, including the Brooklyn Navy Yard, operated under special rules. They needed lighting to function, but they had to shield it. Windows were covered. Lights pointed downward. The goal was to allow work to continue while minimizing the glow visible from offshore. And offshore, in the dark waters of the Atlantic, German submarines continued their hunt. Through 1942 and into 1943, the dimeout didn't stop them entirely, but it helped. Ships leaving New York Harbor were no longer perfectly silhouetted against bright city lights. They were harder to see, harder to target. The submarines had to work harder for each kill. By August 1942, when the first surprise blackout drills happened, Admiral King had, finally, organized effective coastal convoys. Merchant ships traveling in groups, protected by destroyers and corvettes. The number of sinkings started to decline. The second happy time for German submarines was ending. The combination of convoys, increased patrols, and coastal dimouts made attacks much more difficult. But the dimeout remained in effect. Military planners weren't taking chances, and New Yorkers kept living in darkness. Chapter 6. The War Comes Home. While New York practiced blackouts and lived with dimouts, the real war crept closer to home in ways that few people knew about. In June 1942, 4 German saboteurs landed on Long Island. They came ashore at Amagansett Beach, delivered by U-boat, carrying explosives and detailed plans to attack American infrastructure. Bridges, tunnels, water supplies, railroad yards, factories. The plan was to create terror and disrupt war production. A 21-year-old Coast Guard seaman named John Cullen, walking patrol on the beach around midnight, stumbled on the men coming out of the surf. They were dressed strangely, not like fishermen. One of them, speaking perfect English, tried to bribe Cullen to walk away and forget he'd seen them. Cullen, unarmed and outnumbered, took the money and left. Then he ran back to the Coast Guard station and reported what he'd seen. The FBI launched a massive manhunt. The saboteurs made it to New York City, planning to meet up and begin their operations. But one of them, George Dash, had second thoughts. He turned himself in to the FBI and gave up his co-conspirators. The plot fell apart. 8 men were arrested, tried by military tribunal, and 6 were executed. The public didn't learn the full story until later. But for New Yorkers who did hear about it, the message was clear. The war wasn't just something happening overseas. Enemy agents had landed on an American beach, walked onto an American train, and made it into New York City. The threat was real, and the submarine threat remained constant. Through 1942 and into 1943, U-boats continued operating off the American coast. They got closer to New York Harbor than most people realized. One U-boat, U-123, actually positioned itself at the mouth of Ambrose Channel, the direct route into New York Harbor, and spent a day submerged, waiting for targets. In November 1942, U-608 laid 10 mines in New York Harbor itself. One of those mines was discovered by a Navy minesweeper, triggering an underwater explosion that sent a column of water 200 feet into the air. New York Harbor closed for 2 days, the only time during the entire war that happened, while Navy crews swept for the remaining mines. Most New Yorkers never knew about that incident. The newspapers didn't report it. The government kept it quiet, not wanting to create panic. But military officials knew. The submarines weren't just threatening ships offshore, they'd penetrated the harbor itself. The Brooklyn Navy Yard, meanwhile, operated around the clock. By late 1944, over 71,000 people worked there in 3 shifts. They built battleships, aircraft carriers, and auxiliary vessels. They repaired over 5,000 damaged ships. They converted 250 cargo vessels for military use. It was the largest industrial center in the entire Navy. And it was all happening in a partially darkened city, with German submarines occasionally lurking just offshore, and enemy saboteurs proven capable of reaching American soil. The psychological impact of living this way is hard to calculate. Most Americans during World War II never saw combat, never came under attack, never had bombs fall on their neighborhoods. But they lived with the knowledge that it could happen, that the enemy was trying to reach them, that their city was a target. The blackout drills reinforced this knowledge. Every time the siren sounded, it was a reminder. Every time you pulled dark curtains across your windows at night, it connected you to the war. Every time you walked through darkened streets, you were participating in national defense. This was particularly true for people with family members overseas. If your son was fighting in North Africa or the Pacific, if your brother was on a destroyer in the Atlantic, if your father worked at the Navy Yard, the blackouts felt personal. You were doing your small part, accepting inconvenience and discomfort so that the war effort could continue. But it also created strain. The constant low-level stress of wartime preparation, combined with rationing, with men away fighting, with uncertainty about the future, took a toll. Psychologists today would recognize it as a form of collective anxiety. At the time, people just called it the war. Still, New York kept functioning. The port kept operating. Ships kept sailing. Workers kept building battleships. Broadway shows kept performing. Life continued, just darker and more subdued than before. Chapter 7. When the Lights Came Back. The demout lasted from May 1942 until 1945, 3 years of living in partial darkness, 3 years of navigating dark streets, of theaters without bright marquees, of Times Square as a shadow of its former self. The regulations loosened gradually as the war progressed. By 1944, with the U-boat threat significantly reduced, some restrictions eased. But the full restoration of New York's nighttime lights didn't happen until after victory in Europe in May 1945. When Japan surrendered on August 14, 1945, New York exploded with light and celebration. Times Square, dark for 3 years, suddenly blazed again. The famous photograph of a sailor kissing a nurse, capturing the joy of that moment, was taken in Times Square as lights came back on and crowds surged into the streets. The war was over. The blackout was over. New York could be New York again. The restoration happened quickly. Within days, neon signs were back up. Theater marquees blazed with lights. Storefront windows were brightly lit. The statue of Liberty's original torchlighting was restored. Within weeks, it was hard to remember what the dimeout had looked like. But the experience had changed the city in subtle ways. New Yorkers had proven they could cooperate in a crisis, even with rules they didn't like. They'd sacrificed convenience for security. They'd accepted government restrictions on their daily lives that would have seemed unthinkable before the war. The civilian defense network largely dissolved. Air raid wardens turned in their helmets. Blackout curtains came down. Fire spotters left their rooftop positions. The massive volunteer organization that Mayor La Guardia had built disappeared almost as quickly as it had formed. Mayor La Guardia himself left office in December 1945 after 3 terms. He'd guided the city through the Depression and through the war. The blackouts were just one part of that, but they were emblematic of his approach to leadership. Energetic, hands-on, refusing to accept that problems were too big to solve. Under his direction, New York had organized the largest civilian defense operation in America, and had kept the nation's most important port functioning throughout the war. The Brooklyn Navy Yard started downsizing almost immediately after Japan's surrender. The peak employment of 71,000 people dropped rapidly as wartime contracts ended. Many of the workers, particularly women who'd been hired to replace men serving in the military, lost their jobs. By 1946, employment at the yard had fallen below 20,000. The massive wartime production machine, which had built some of the most powerful warships in history, slowed to a peacetime pace. The port of New York remained important, but the frantic intensity of wartime shipping ended. Cargo vessels continued sailing, but without the urgency of supporting armies overseas. The city's waterfront, which had worked around the clock for years, returned to more normal operations. And at sea, the Atlantic became safe again. German U-boats surrendered or were scuttled. The threat that had made the blackouts necessary vanished. Merchant ships could sail at night without fear. The silhouettes against coastal lights no longer attracted submarines, because there were no more submarines to attract. The total cost of the U-boat campaign against American shipping was staggering. From January to August 1942, German submarines sank 609 ships totaling 3.1 million tons, against a loss of only 22 U-boats. Nearly 15,000 merchant seamen died in the Battle of the Atlantic overall, including the thousands killed in American waters in 1942. Could the blackouts have been implemented sooner? Could those deaths have been prevented? Military historians have debated this for decades. The consensus seems to be that Admiral King's refusal to implement convoys and coastal blackouts earlier cost lives. Unnecessarily. The British had offered advice based on their own hard-won experience. That advice was largely ignored until the casualties became undeniable. But once the blackouts were implemented, once convoys were organized, the situation improved dramatically. The combination of better tactics and better defensive measures worked. By late 1942, U-boat attacks off the American coast had declined significantly. By 1943, the submarines had largely abandoned American waters, focusing on the mid-Atlantic where convoys were still vulnerable. The people who'd lived through the dimouts years carried memories of that time. The strangeness of walking through a darkened Times Square, the wail of sirens during surprise drills, the careful navigation of streets without streetlights, the tiny glimpse of stars visible from city streets for the first time in decades. For children who grew up in wartime New York, the dimeout was normal. They didn't remember the bright city that existed before. They grew up thinking that darkened streets and covered windows were just how cities looked at night. The return of bright lights after the war must have seemed almost shocking to them, as if the city had suddenly become a different place. For older New Yorkers, the contrast was stark. They remembered the vibrant nightlife of the 1920s and 1930s, the neon paradise of Times Square in its glory. The return to brightness in 1945 felt like a restoration of something precious that had been lost. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Darkness. Today, almost no physical trace of the 1942 blackouts remains in New York City. The city has been rebuilt and modernized so many times that the wartime world has vanished. Times Square is brighter now than it was even before the war. LED screens and digital billboards create a glow visible from space. The idea of turning off all those lights, of plunging the city into darkness, seems almost impossible. But the legacy exists in memory and in history. The blackout years are a reminder that American cities once lived under the direct threat of enemy attack, that civilians organized themselves for defense, that ordinary people accepted significant disruptions to their daily lives because they understood those disruptions served a larger purpose. The civilian defense organization that Mayor La Guardia built was the largest of its kind in American history. Over 5 million volunteers nationwide within 8 months of Pearl Harbor. Air raid wardens, fire spotters, auxiliary police, medical teams, all organized and trained. It was an impressive mobilization of civilian effort. The effectiveness of those efforts is harder to judge. German bombers never reached American cities. The attack the blackouts were supposed to protect against never happened. In that sense, all the drills, all the disruption, all the casualties during practice exercises were preparation for something that never occurred. But the submarine threat was real, and the coastal dimouts did help protect shipping. Ships that might have been silhouetted against bright city lights were harder to target. The combination of dimouts and convoys made U-boat attacks more difficult. Lives were saved, even if the exact number can never be calculated. The experience also demonstrated something important about American society during World War II. The capacity for collective action. The willingness to accept government restrictions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The sense of shared purpose that allowed 8 million New Yorkers to cooperate in something as challenging as a citywide blackout. That spirit of shared sacrifice extended beyond the blackouts. Rationing of food, gasoline, and consumer goods, collection drives for scrap metal and rubber, war bond drives, victory gardens. The entire civilian population was mobilized to support the war effort. The blackouts were just one element of that larger mobilization. After the war, that spirit faded. The specific circumstances that made it necessary vanished with victory. Americans wanted to return to normal life. The restrictions, the shortages, the constant reminders of war, all of it could be set aside. And it was, remarkably quickly. But people who lived through that period remembered it. They remembered what it felt like to be part of a national effort. To accept personal inconvenience for a larger cause. To trust that the government was asking them to do things for good reason. That memory shaped a generation. Today, the idea of a citywide blackout in New York for any reason seems almost absurd. The city is too dependent on electricity, too connected, too complex to function without lights. A blackout now would be an emergency, not a defense measure. The infrastructure, the economy, the daily life of the city, all of it assumes constant electrical power and constant illumination. But in 1942, New York proved it could do it. Could function, could continue, could maintain the nation's most important port and largest industrial base, all while operating in partial darkness. It wasn't easy, it wasn't comfortable, but it was possible. The physical evidence of the blackout years is largely gone, but photographs remain. Pictures of Times Square and Dimouts, showing how different the city looked. Images of air raid wardens in their white helmets. Photos of massive blackout drills with streets emptying and lights going dark across entire neighborhoods. The Brooklyn Navy Yard still exists, though it's no longer a military facility. It's now a manufacturing and commercial complex, home to dozens of businesses. The dry docks that built battleships now repair civilian vessels. The buildings, where 71,000 workers once labored around the clock, now house offices and studios in small factories. It's a connection to that wartime past, even if the specific activities have changed. Some of the people who lived through the blackout years are still alive, in their 80s and 90s now. Their memories of wartime New York are first-hand accounts of a city under stress. They remember the sirens, the darkened streets, the sense of uncertainty about when or if the war would come directly to their neighborhoods. Those memories matter because they provide context for understanding how dramatically World War II changed American life. Not just for soldiers overseas, but for civilians at home. The war reached into every aspect of daily existence, including something as basic as whether you could turn on your lights at night. The blackouts also provide a case study in civil defense. What works, what doesn't, how to organize millions of people for collective action. The casualties during practice drills raised uncomfortable questions about the cost of preparedness. Was it worth risking people's lives during drills to prepare for an attack that might never come? Military planners said yes. Some civilians disagreed. That tension between security and safety, between preparation and risk, never fully resolved. But the program continued. The drills kept happening. The dimeout remained in effect. And New York, like other coastal cities, learned to live with darkness as the price of security. When historians look back at World War II, the blackouts are usually a footnote, a minor detail in a much larger story. But for the people who lived through them, who navigated darkened streets and pulled heavy curtains across their windows every night for 3 years, the blackouts were a defining feature of the war years. They were the most visible, the most constant reminder that their country was at war, and that they had a role to play in that war, even if that role was simply accepting darkness.